Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I believe we already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and this is episode 50. Coming up, a conversation with Peter Rankin, Head of Energy and Environmental Standards at the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. Following the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, significant changes have been made to the building safety regime in the UK. The Building Safety Act established the Building Safety Regulator as part of the Health and Safety Executive. This new regulator took over many of the responsibilities previously held by MHCLG, that's the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and local authorities, particularly for higher risk buildings. The Building Safety Regulator now has several key responsibilities: regulating higher risk buildings, overseeing the safety and standards of all buildings, and assisting and encouraging competency among the building environment industry and registered building inspectors. This transition represents a significant shift in the UK's approach to building safety, moving from a system primarily managed by local authorities and government departments to one with a dedicated regulator within the HSE structure. Peter has been at the heart of building standards for years, and particularly from my perspective, standards around ventilation. So it was an enormous privilege to finally sit down with him and chat about this new reality for building standards, what it means for the sector, and at a higher level, a view from inside the machine of building standards. We talk about, or at least I talk about a lot, the intent of regulations, how we construct language around these things and communicate it. And I and Peter share a lot of common ground here. If you're interested in how we improve buildings over time and solve the challenges we face on the ground, I think this is a fascinating episode. Thanks for listening as always. Do check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Peter Rankin. You've had a bit of a big move recently, right? And brought some people with you. So I thought that would be a really good place to start. It's quite unusual for something like building standards to fundamentally move from one place to another in government circles. Tell us a little bit about that. What was the kind of the idea behind that officially?
Yeah, exactly. So the Building Safety Regulator was established in 2022, and that changed a lot of things. I think probably most people who are aware of the Building Safety Act probably think of it as an act that was dealing with fire risks, but also structural risks in high-risk residential buildings and high-rise residential buildings. But the Act actually did a lot more than that, and it does a lot more than just looking at those particular types of buildings as well. So a couple of things that it did was, one, introduced a new regime to look at the competency of building control assessors. That sits in a different team. It also abolished the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, which was a statutory committee that was there as a group of experts to directly advise the Secretary of State on building regulations and building safety matters, and established a replacement committee, the Buildings Advisory Committee, a very similarly named committee, that was set up to directly advise and give technical advice to the Building Safety Regulator. And that's a committee that is comprised of experts from industry. The part of the change that influenced me and my team was that the Building Safety Regulator was established as the technical authority on buildings to give independent advice to ministers, to the department, and to the Secretary of State, but also to be able to run our own agenda and decide where is the best place to spend our resource and to spend our staff time in looking at not just building safety matters. There's a very wide duty that the Building Safety Regulator has, which is to keep the safety and standards of buildings under review, which is Section 5 of the Building Safety Act. So that's huge. It's beyond fire safety and structural safety, and it's beyond just those high-risk residential buildings that was a big focus of the Building Safety Act, but not the only thing that the Building Safety Act did. And it's the first time in history that I'm aware of that these functions have been moved out of central government since the introduction of the National Building Regulations Standards in the 1960s. So it's a huge, it's a big change, and my focus and the team's focus in the last year since we've been here for about 18 months now is mostly, to be honest, been to make sure that transition has happened smoothly, that there hasn't been a gap in government function in respect to the technical standards and technical advice that ministers get on buildings. And I think we're moving to a place where we're able to plough our own furrow now, actually, and realise a lot more of the benefits of us being now in an arm's length organisation. That we're able to decide where to best focus the resources of government in its technical expertise of buildings to fulfil that function that's set out in the Building Safety Act, which is to improve the safety and standards of buildings.
And where is home? So where is that now? Did you consider yourself part of the Building Safety Regulator or part of the HSE? Like it's
yes.
Where's home for you now in that sense?
Yeah. So the Building Safety Regulator is the regulator named in the Act. That sits within the HSE, and I am an HSE employee, and my whole team is. So absolutely, we are a core part of the Health and Safety Executive now. Myself and my team were previously part of what's now called Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. It was the Levelling Up Department at the time that we moved. It's changed its name a number of times over the years.
Sure.
So yes, we're absolutely part of HSE. I think that's brought quite a number of benefits, actually, in that the Building Safety Regulator, we haven't had to stand up a whole new organisation completely from scratch. We've joined a well-established, well-functioning regulator that's got a fantastic track record in workplace health and safety over the last 50 years. And there's a lot that we've gained, and there's a lot that we've learned, that we're able to learn from the success of that regulator, and to apply it to the safety and standards of buildings, regardless of tenure. So it's a big change. It's a big change for me, and it's a big change for us as a team. But it's also quite a large change for the HSE as an organisation. As you know, like I say, for almost the entirety of its 50-year life, it's been focused on improving workplace health and safety, which it's done a fantastic job at. But now it's got this other brand new remit as the Building Safety Regulator as well, and under a different Act of Parliament than the Health and Safety at Work Act. But there's lots of parallels, and there's lots of sense of this function being at the HSE. I've always seen the building regulations as being sort of almost an equivalent to the Health and Safety Work Act, but for buildings, but for homes and other types of buildings. So we've made some real, we've made some really good connections and things here, particularly with colleagues looking at workplace health and safety, obviously. But the other huge benefit as well is that the HSE has a fantastic science capability, and has a big facility up in Buxton, with the laboratories and testing capability. Lots of people much cleverer than myself with PhDs and lots of letters after their names. So in a sense, it feels more like a home for my team, who are mainly people from various different technical backgrounds. I've got architects, public health experts, energy experts, and we can have lots of these peer-to-peer conversations with and access to other expertise around the organisation. So that's been a real benefit as well, and we are we're doing lots of new research that we wouldn't have been able to do actually in the department, because we wouldn't have had access to it.
There's loads to unpack there, but you can see so much crossover between the HSE and building standards, but particularly perhaps from the lens that I tend to look at stuff through, which is ventilation and health. Obviously, there's enormous crossover with workplace health and safety and workplace health and well-being. It seems like a very natural home in that sense. I imagine there's other parts of building standards that are perhaps a little less of a glove fit. Thinking things like energy and things like that might be a little bit outside of the HSE's realm, perhaps, particularly from a ventilation standards perspective. It's always felt a little like in standards, a little less so in the UK, but perhaps in other jurisdictions, that the non-residential sector has been a bit of a tack on to guidance. And it's always there's always been this straddling somewhere between HSE and workplace health and safety and engineering SIBSI type guidance, part B and A and all of that kind of stuff. And then a kind of a nod to it to some degree within building standards. So I imagine that closer tie to HSE must be that could be very powerful from a workplace ventilation and air quality perspective going forwards, from a standards perspective, having that link.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. Yes, yeah, and I'd say that's quite a good observation, to be honest, that the building regulations guidance through the approved documents tends to be quite focused on domestic, particularly for ventilation. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think the professions are different. Domestic installations, you tend to get a different profession. You don't always get a proper ventilation design. Non-domestic buildings, I think there's a perception that a lot of them look after themselves, in that there's industry standards that people are building to. You'll often get a consultant involved who will make sure that it's well ventilated and it's built to the right standard. But also, there's just such a huge range of non-domestic buildings.
I was going to say, I mean, whatever about the range of residential scenarios, you're effectively talking about boxes with people in them, whether they're in flats or houses or whatever. You go into the non-residential sector and you know, schools, factories, clinical environment, it's just endless. So you can't, very difficult to capture that in a kind of an approved document, so to speak. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that when as far as non-domestic buildings are concerned, my philosophy would be that government wants to give guidance on the overall standards, and there is a regulation in place, of course, that applies to non-domestic buildings the same way that it does domestic buildings. The regulation is very simple when ventilation is concerned. It's as you all know, Simon, there's one ventilation requirement on the performance of your ventilation in the law, that is that there should be adequate ventilation for people in the building. That's all the law says.
Yeah,
and that applies to most types of buildings. And for non-domestic buildings, I suppose
it's similar in a lot of ways, actually, I'd say, Peter, in the sense, if you look at how health and safety at work acts tend to work, they tend to have that kind of, we call it green box or grey box regulation, but they tend to have that kind of plain English, thou shalt provide safe, blah-de-blah, for people at work. That's when codes of practice and guidance then fall in behind those kind of generic statements to fill in the gaps, to say, well, this is how in normal circumstances we would expect you to achieve that kind of prima facie compliance element. So there's a lot of analogies in the structures, in the sense that you kind of got these very high level legal frameworks that virtually nobody reads. And then you have the structures below that in guidance documents and approved documents and codes of practice and so on, in both sides, that start to put meat on the bone and provide people with a frame of reference. It'll be really interesting to see over the next decade whether there's how that crossover manifests between approved documents and the type of guidance that comes out of HSE typically.
Yes. And in fact, in the past, the HSE guidance through the approved codes of practice and building regulations guidance have often looked to one another, possibly in an informal way. But sometimes when you dig under it, you find that the ACOP actually says something or sets a standard, and you dig into it and find out why it set a particular standard, and it's because we'd set it originally in the approved document. It's
kind of merry-go-round over time.
It's funny how some of these things work, and I think the influence of standards making and writing standards is sometimes so great that once it's written into a government approved standard, people often take that as read, and sometimes when you dig into where these figures have come from, because if you look across the approved documents, we've got things that you've got to put numbers against things. Okay, and I think ventilation actually is in a pretty good place, and we had a fundamental look at it a few years ago. But across some other things, you look at where these numbers have come from, and it's unclear, because it was developed 20, 30 years ago in some places, and so I think it's really important actually that we do periodically undertake a sort of fundamental back to first principles look at all of the things in guidance, because there is that risk that that things are taken as authoritative because it says it in an approved document. And that was one of the things actually that I looked at when I first joined government in 2015 in the department, was to undertake a fundamental review of approved document F, and absolutely picked it all apart, right the way back to first principles and the equations and things that underpinned the pattern book that everybody was using when they're designing new homes.
There's a book in that somewhere, Peter. I'd say that job of picking that apart, because a lot of those original first principle numbers were lads in white coats from the BRE in the mid-80s walking around doing calculations on the back of a fag packet and sticking fingers in the air and trying to agree first principles back in the early days. And I think this is the challenge, and this is the fascinating thing when I talk to you is the evolution of these standards, because they take time, and we'll come on to that later in the podcast, but it's an enormous process. There's lots of consequential impacts of changing standards that have to be thought through, a lot of systems thinking. So this stuff can't just be happening every year. And the challenge is that time moves on, and you blink and a number that was determined in the mid 80s or the early 90s, all of a sudden you're in 2024 and you're going, where did we get that from? Like, where did that idea of, I remember back 10, 15 years ago, there was a question brought up, quite an innocent one, when we were starting to insulate attics, about where did we determine how big the strip was supposed to be on the soffit for attic insulation? Because we're now covering that up with insulation and people are having to put tile vents in. What's the equivalent? What are the actual formulas and maths for that? And all of a sudden you're trying to dig out historical papers, trying to determine who came up with that original formula for an air change rate effectively in an attic space. And you realise 20 years has slipped by and people have left.
Absolutely. And a lot of the time when you're writing a technical standard, there isn't an answer lying about.
No.
And you can't do the research because it's going to take 2 or 3 years, or perhaps even longer, and several £100,000. So the trick is to get a bunch of people around a table and pick out something that we think is reasonable. And that's to be honest, that's some of the basis behind some of these figures that have got sort of unclear origins. And generally over time, you sort of find out whether it's about right.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the realizations that I've made over time around advisory documents like approved documents or technical guidance documents and so on, is that they are reasonable assumption documents. You know, they're prima facie documents. They're documents that are there to guide us, to provide a frame of reference. That there aren't necessarily, the numbers that appear in them, while they may look definitive, are anything but often. And I think when you start to understand that, like the fundamental intent of these documents, why they exist, it changes your worldview of standards a little bit about why we see some of the problems that we see, why the supply chains are set up sometimes in the way that they're set up. Because we can't. You would take something like ventilation is a really good example of that. Something with so many confounding factors like natural ventilation, where we don't know what direction the wind is going to be. We don't know how hard it's going to blow. We don't know how many people are going to be in a building on a given day. We don't know exactly where the air paths or leak points are within a building. Yet in a document, we've got to try and provide a tool for somebody to say, how big a hole I should put in a wall and where it should be.
Exactly.
And that number is taken as a benchmark. Yet when you systems think that through, there's a lot of very broad assumptions that go into that very precise number. And that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. That's the challenge. Is we're writing a standard that's meant to be applied to all homes, or in all homes in normal circumstances, we say.
Yeah.
So if you're building a home that broadly fits with the circumstances for which the approved document standard is written, we've got to put a number against that, but it will have all those assumptions against it. And I think possibly there's been a slow but steady cultural change in the construction sector, probably even before the time that I started working in it, where I think people are less likely to have a professional doing a ventilation design that's willing to go against what the approved document says, or that takes its own path. And I think that's not something that I think is desirable. Actually, I think the approved documents should be seen as guidance, which is what they are. It's guidance on how to let's take approved document F. Guidance on how to, in normal circumstances, construct a building that's going to be adequately ventilated. But there are lots of other ways that you can ventilate a building, and I think if people were willing a bit more to go back to first principles and to present alternative solutions to building control, I think that would be really beneficial, and that's possibly part of the evolution of the approved documents that's maybe missing in some respects now. Is that I think in the past you would have had that innovation, you'd have had a bit more of that innovation, and then the next update, the next revision of the approved document then adopts that innovation as the new minimum standard, because that's been out there, it's been proven, and it's been tested. But it's my personal feeling that I think people are much more or much less willing to take that risk of doing something different and rely very heavily on what it says in the approved document. And it'd be nice if that culture shifted a little bit, actually.
And I think it will. From a personal perspective, I think the way the built environment is moving and our ability to measure outcomes in ways that we couldn't have even conceived 10 years ago will fundamentally shift that perspective, I think, a little bit. We've seen that with energy. Our ability to much more precisely understand the performance gap when it comes to energy use in buildings has changed, I think, a little bit, where those risks are taken, that people are making their own decisions and are prepared to be accountable outside of guidance more and more. Air quality, of course, is very complex and very difficult to measure, and there's a lot of things beyond the building that impact it. So it's very difficult to stand over an air quality outcome as a designer, because so much of it is outside of your control.
Yeah.
But there's certainly no excuses from a ventilation performance perspective to be able to stand over outcomes. Largely speaking, air movement is measurable. We should be able to make the decisions to say, look, this is what we've decided we want. So I think we'll see that cultural shift, but it is that, and you must have had this conversation over and over again, that the fundamentals, the philosophy behind what is a minimum standards prima facie document for, Is it the target or is it the backstop? And in a construction sector with a supply chain, there's always that friction of, you tell me what I'm supposed to do and we'll do that as fast and as cheaply as possible because we're under so much pressure the other direction. There's always going to be that friction, isn't there, with standards and codes of practice and guidance, that people are looking for a toolkit, an answer to say, if I hit this number or if I do it that way, that's my accountability covered. I've done my job.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always been clear, and I'm sure the organisation would be as well, that the approved documents are a minimum standard, and if people go beyond that, that's fantastic. But I think what you've said is really important. Actually, is that as much as we might like people to go beyond the minimum standards, when it comes to house building, I think because of the way that the house building market works, in that you'll have there'll be a plot of land, okay, and house builders will bid for that plot of land, and whoever can pay the most for that plot of land gets the plot of land and can build houses on it. How do you bid the most for the plot of land? It's frankly by building houses with the best profit margins, and that's not a system that encourages people to go beyond minimum standards. And if you want house building that goes beyond minimum standards, you're generally hoping to have a progressive landowner who insists on higher minimum standards at the expense of getting as much value for their land as they can. So as much as we'd like people to go beyond minimum standards, there is that just fundamental way that the house building market works that doesn't necessarily encourage that kind of innovation and investment.
Yeah, and there's a nuance to it as well, in that what we don't want to end up in a scenario of is that there's a minimum standard, a calculation that you need to get over the line of, and you just double that. As long as there's no major cost implications to you, I'll just double those numbers so I know I'm not going to get a callback or be held accountable for being below that minimum. With something like ventilation, that has an energy impact potentially, So what we don't want to see equally out the other side of it is to say, well, look, I need to get over X to be compliant with the guidance document. I'm just going to add 50% to that to make sure I don't get that callback. You do that at a large scale in house building, and there are some unintended consequences of that approach.
To be honest, I would see the forces there acting in a different direction, because I think for a house builder, what are they going to get callbacks on? And when it comes to ventilation systems, generally it will be householders who are upset that their ventilation system is making too much noise. And we've certainly seen from some of the studies that we've done in the past, a culture of installing and commissioning systems to reduce the amount of complaints that you'd get from householders, particularly from fan noise. But that's obviously not a ventilation first or a ventilation led way of commissioning and designing a ventilation system. It really has to do both, and that's quite difficult actually. Installing and designing a ventilation system, I say it's quite difficult. Installing and designing a ventilation system that gives you enough fresh air, but also isn't noisy and works for the householder, needs a level of understanding from the installer. It needs to be designed. I think that's the first point, is that a lot of these systems isn't a design. It's some notes on a drawing somewhere, and the installer has to figure it all out. That's not the way that you're going to guarantee or make it likely that you're going to end up in a situation where you've got a well-designed ventilation system that meets all its purposes. So certainly, like I say, in the past, we've definitely seen that commissioning for noise, turning fan speeds down to reduce householder complaints, but at the expense of good ventilation.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point that you make, and I think that there's two parts for me with guidance documents. There's the intent of the document. Is that clear to people what the document is for, how it should be used and interpreted, so that people have the best chance that they have to understand what the regulator wants, what building standards require, so that the policing side of it is as light as possible. And one of the things that I know you've spent an inordinate amount of time, particularly in the last couple of iterations of the building standards document, is refining the plain English nature of that document and trying to both restructure it and reword it in a way where that intent is as clear as possible. Because traditionally, particularly approved documents and guidance documents are hard going. I mean, ventilation has always been one of the easier ones, to be frank. I mean, the poor sods that have to wade through Part B, I always feel very sorry for, because there's so much interpretation required within them. But Part F is probably one of the easier ones, ironically. But even still, like, people have found them traditionally very hard going, and I think my view anyway is that the latest iteration of ADF is probably one of the most well written guidance documents that I see within the islands of the UK, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, in how it's set out, so that somebody with relatively low technical experience can navigate that document and have a sense of what the intent is.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad, because, like you say, I spent a lot of time. On that document, and that was so. When I and this was years and years in the making. When I first joined MHCLG, I picked apart the entirety of approved document F and rewrote it from scratch, which doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
With approved documents, what you find with old approved documents is every approved document has a lead author, and they still do. But I think what you found in the past is that a number of the approved documents, so that there's an approved document for each part of the building regulations, as you know, from Part A, structure, to Part S, electric vehicle charging. Each of those approved documents you could tell who'd written it, because each author had their own style. And in the mid 2010s, we did a lot of work with our publisher, actually, in trying to develop some common principles to try and standardize the way that those approved documents are written, try and make it much more plain English. I think approved document F was a technically sound document. I think the previous version, which was the 2013 version, I think. But in a lot of respects, I think it was written a bit like a textbook, with lots of background information. And I came into the department, and I'm looking at a landscape in ventilation where the big challenge isn't necessarily the technical requirements of approved document F themselves. It's compliance, it's checking. So it's getting people who are installing ventilation systems to be able to understand what it is they need to install and what the performance needs to look like. Getting building control to be able to understand what it is they're checking and to see whether it's compliant, and getting a household. And I think that the panacea is that a household will be able to read the approved document and to know whether they've got what they should have got from the person who was carrying out the building work. So we stripped quite a lot out of the approved document. I think these things tend to grow over time because you add more and more things.
Yeah.
But we stripped a lot of the background descriptive stuff out of the approved document, which was all valid and it was all right. But my philosophy was really, what do those three different parties need to know? The person installing and designing, the person checking, and the householder. Actually, they don't necessarily need to know the background of ventilation principles. I mean, you can argue that some people in that chain should, but they don't. But the approved document, I think, has a specific purpose, which is there to try to maximise the chance that ventilation installation and design is going to lead to good outcomes for the occupier. And I think it being absolutely clear in its purpose and what the standards are, I think is more important than some other things. Another interesting thing we did with the approved document was to the previous standard approved document F had lots of different tables. So when you were doing a natural ventilation design, you'd look through all these tables, you'd get to a different part of the table, and it would tell you your total ventilator area for the building, which was very precise, and was sort of academically the right answer. But we took that away and thought, actually, is that however many pages in the approved document of different tables and cross-referencing,
and the notes and clauses which you had to understand where and when to apply bits. It gets complicated right quick, doesn't it? When you
So was that too complicated to think that all those parties would install and check things and know whether they've got the right installation? Could we actually maybe even compromise a little bit on the flexibility of the standard, because that gave you lots of different ranges of trickle ventilator areas. So we made the decision to try and just standardize it. This is the ventilation provision you should have in a bedroom. That's it, one figure. This is the ventilation provision you should have in this type of room, rather than having to cross-reference lots of tables. And that might mean that you might have a slight over-provision of ventilation compared to the previous system.
Yeah. But practically, you're drilling down into that philosophical question of who's this document for,
yes,
and what's the most likely route to a decent outcome. And the reality of it is, if a builder who's dipping into a toolbox because he doesn't naturally know what the answer is, has to be able to reference that information easily, and somebody coming along behind them, like a building control officer, has to be able to understand if that's been applied correctly. And a homeowner, potentially, as you say, all the way downstream, needs to be able to look at the product that they've ended up with as a whole and understand to some level whether they got what they paid for. If there are too many formulas and tables behind that, it makes it very difficult to get that outcome ultimately.
Yeah.
But that's a really interesting. It's a really interesting philosophical point for with these layers, who those documents are intended for, not just the intent, the technical intent, but like who are they intended for, and the requirements that have to sit somewhere anyway. So, for example, you can only take the plain English so far, I guess, but at some point there are standards behind the language you use in guidance documents, things like shall and should and all of that good stuff, which there are various ISO standards for. There is a playbook here that you have to follow at some point. So you've got this balancing act between your obligation as a standards authority to present stuff technically correct from a language perspective, but make it readable so it doesn't turn into, and I'm sorry, Scotland, the Scottish building standards wedge, where you just end up with this behemoth of a document that gets very difficult to navigate through, and it changes and you can't find where, very difficult to see where that change is. You've got a balance. None of this stuff happens in isolation, does it?
No, exactly. And like you say, we've plain English edited approved document F, and as we have done for other approved documents. In fact, there's other approved documents that you get to go through the process actually, but approved document F is one of the front runners. But like you said, there's also a process of making sure we're very precise with the language that is used, and we have our own internal protocols of when you should use the word should and must, and things that you would never even think about, like the use of the word may.
Yeah.
So a lot of the approved documents in the old style would say the designer may do this, for example. And that's a very ambiguous statement, because may actually has two meanings.
Yeah.
I mean, the designer might do something, or the designer is permitted to do something. And if you open up one of the old approved documents and you just Control F and search for the word may, it can pop up all over the place, and then you read it with that new perspective and think, actually, I'm sure the author, you can see what intent the author had, but if you try and read it from the other perspective, you can come to a completely different conclusion. So, so that plain English, all that logic checking, is a really important part of the standards making process, and I really enjoy it, to be honest. It probably sounds really dull to a lot of people. But coming up with a product that's that does its job really precisely and well, I think is really satisfying to me.
I'll have you back to the podcast in a minute. I just wanted to briefly talk to you about 21 Degrees, a partner of this podcast. Formerly the Green Building Store, they were founded in 1995 by three exceptional building professionals. The company grew out of their frustration with the poor availability of ecological building products. I've known them for years as the go-to company in the UK for end-to-end design-led MVHR systems. We spend the majority of our time in our homes, so they should be the best they can be, comfortable and healthy to live in, with exceptional efficiency. In fact, life-changing homes. At 21 Degrees, you won't find a more trustworthy, straight-talking, passionate about what they do, and approachable group of people. I speak a lot about the performance gap on this podcast and what we can achieve if we value ventilation highly enough. 21 Degrees embodies that sentiment for me. So if you're building a home, looking to install ventilation, or need to talk to experts in the field, I can't recommend them highly enough. Links are in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net and you can Google We Are 21 Degrees. Now, back to the podcast. Yeah, and I get that completely. I mean, I'm a systems thinker, and a document like an approved document sits in a point of time in history, in context of where the sector is at any given moment. So its framing and it will be viewed differently as time moves on. So it's a fluid, it's within a fluid process. It has a particular purpose for particular people, and very small changes can have systems impacts downstream that are, without spending real time buried in that document and those industries, are very difficult to foresee. And I stay in lane. I'm a ventilation and air quality person, and yes, I look at standards in many different countries. But even something like ADF, which I've been reading for years, as you can imagine, you still reread sections of it because you're asked a question. You go, I never thought it would be viewed like that. Actually, that's a really good point. There's a consequence of that. Or where did that number actually come from? Why are we saying that? What would happen if we thought about that differently? Those, when you're deep in those documents, as I often am, and I'm you're up to your neck in it. I imagine that is very interesting because you find these nuances constantly. It's very difficult to make a perfect document in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And the I mean, you'd be surprised. You might be surprised at how little time of all of the stuff we've got to do we spend editing the approved documents. I think that's it's probably I do less of it these days because I've got a reasonable sized team now, but actually even they probably spend the majority of their time doing all of that stuff up front to get to the point where we can change standards. And I do wonder how it looks to the outside world. Actually, that I often hear frustration from the outside world about how long things take and to how long change takes, and I think that's probably quite difficult for people to. I think that's probably quite difficult for people to appreciate. Why can't you just change this in the approved document? Why do you have to wait for the next review?
I think people get a sense that there are consequences to industry that requires a process of public consultation, and the consultations are a process in of themselves. Somebody's got to sit down and reimagine certain elements of it, write that down. There's an internal process that goes on. I've been involved in those as well, and then it goes out to public consultation, and then that has to be reviewed. Somebody at some point has to make so I think people get that those things can take a year or two to work through, particularly big documents or changes that are going to have big consequential impacts. But you've described to me in the past as well, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background outside of those consultations where you're having to systems think impacts on public health, safety, the financial implications to the exchequer of a certain thing. Everything has to be for a single document. I imagine there's a whole bunch behind it in the back office that you have to process and work through, that this stuff does not happen in isolation, that you have to present a case for almost every change and try and work through some of the downstream positive or negative impacts of that.
Exactly. So I think there's if you look at the process of updating government guidance on the building regulations, I think you can take it if we take it way further back than the point where you'd ever get to a consultation, you'd look at. So I'm looking at. One of the main things I look at is simply where we're spending our resources. So I have a team of 12 people who are great, but they're looking across all of the different parts of the building regulations, aside from fire and structural safety, which sits in a different team, from moisture through toxic substances, energy efficiency, ventilation, drainage and water, electrical safety, right the way down to electric vehicle charge points. So there's a point where we've got to decide and plan out how we spend that resource, how we spend our limited research budget and limited bandwidth. And like you say, we can't whimsically change individual parts of the guidance or the regulations because of the impact it has. I really strongly think this is writing building regulations standards is one of the most influential jobs in government, because these homes hopefully will last for generations, and we do have to account for the impact of any changes that we're making to standards. Like you say, we'll where it's relevant, we'll quantify and monetize health impacts. Generally, when we're updating approved documents, these will be monetizing benefits, and of course we'll have to monetize the costs as well. And generally, when you're talking about building regulation standards, the largest costs land on the house builders, and there is a consequential effect on the economy. Construction accounts for about 7% of the economy, but also governments of any colour over the last however long you go have always wanted to build homes, and there's a large reliance on the private sector to build homes as well. So we do need to quantify where we're adding regulatory burden, quantify the impact that that's going to have on house building rollout. We want to be a proportionate regulator, and make sure that what we're doing is proportionate, and that does involve a lot of work to quantify all of that and demonstrate proportionality. And there's a whole government machine as well to work before you can even get to a consultation stage. The Building Safety Regulator is arm's length from central government, and that's great. And I have much more freedom now to decide how and where we spend our resource and our research budgets than we did previously when we were sitting under a minister. But ultimately, the approved documents and the building regulations themselves still need to be signed off by a minister. So there is still that. So there's still that check, and I think that's you can argue that's right, and the ministers are the people who are publicly accountable, not us as civil servants. So, but that can take a lot of time and research, and we've got to work with working groups. There are so many interested parties as well that there's always the risk with any change that there'll be winners and losers. And I think we've talked about it in the past, haven't we, as well, where we can change one line of a guidance document that might seem innocuous, but actually that's somebody's whole business that's affected by that. We can, it makes and breaks businesses that the guidance documents that go along with the building regulations. So we have to be really, really careful about the impact of our work, which is which is one of the reasons that there's such a big process. But it's all there for good reason.
Yeah, and if it was easy, everybody would do it. And it's also important work. So it does need to be thought through. Is your sense from within that? I'm speaking to you on World Ventilate Day, that ventilation and air quality has ratcheted up the importance level within these standards and guidance documents, that it's taken more seriously now perhaps than it was 10, 15 years ago as a fundamental pillar of the built environment. Have you seen a growing recognition in the importance? You certainly see that in the intent of the document and the importance it places on measuring and checking. Yeah. But within the kind of the government circles and the civil service machine, do you get a sense that ventilation and air quality has moved up a little bit?
I think air quality and the quality of people's homes absolutely has risen on the agenda in the last few years, particularly in the social rented and private rented sectors. But that applies to building regulations as well. So there's definitely more interest. There's more parliamentary interest as well, which to be honest has helped ministers of various different persuasions to understand the importance of ventilation and indoor air quality. But it's hard. It's hard for ministers actually to sometimes to be able to find the time to focus on the stuff that they've all got very wide. Ministers have always got very wide portfolios that cover a vast number of things, and something very technical and detailed like the standards for ventilation, the approved documents. Actually, really, the minister's role is we are there to support ministers and support the government's agenda, and that definitely includes building homes that are of good quality and that are safe and healthy places to live. And so I've absolutely definitely seen that rising up the agenda of the last few years.
And one of the things we've seen a real shift in, particularly in the guidance documents over the last few years, is an increasing emphasis on testing and performance. And that's been quite clear. Whereas before it was more about this is what you should be achieving. There wasn't much about the process of how you check that that's what you've got. That's been a real shift, hasn't it? Particularly in the last revisions. And I think if we're out for consultation at the moment, and again, there's potential shifts there as well. That there's a growing recognition on the importance of it's about what you've got, not what you said you'd give. But that is a big change for industry, because at the moment, currently, there's very little testing of the performance of those systems. As much as we've been saying you should commission ventilation systems for, I don't know, what is it now, 10 years or so, there's very little of that actually happening meaningfully. Whereas the guidance documents now are really, really screwing down on that and saying, like, this is what we expect to be done.
Yeah. So as you know, we updated approved document F in 2021. We consulted as part of the Future Homes Standard consultation, which ran from late 2023, and it closed in January of this year. As part of that consultation, we proposed another update to approved document F in certain respects. Like we said earlier, we've already taken a fundamental look at the air quality principles behind approved document F, and I think this iteration is looking at ways that we can improve the compliance and actual realised performance of systems. So there are a number of proposals in that consultation that aim to achieve that. There's some additional testing requirements in situ. But also what we tried to do is to put some extra guidance in there about the competency of the people carrying out the work. So if you look at approved document P, okay, for example, which is electrical safety, it's not that different in the way that it works from approved document F. Okay, there's a functional requirement, and this is how you achieve that functional requirement for electrical safety. In the same way that there's a functional requirement for ventilation safety, and yet we often get the question, well, people undertaking electrical work need to be qualified, and people undertaking ventilation work don't. But that's only the case because of a cultural view of these systems, and I think some inertia on the sort of professionalisation of the different sectors is that we're lucky enough to have a highly professional, a fairly professionalised electoral safety sector with well-established competent person schemes and building control bodies who will take it quite seriously if somebody tries to do an electrical installation but doesn't have the right qualifications.
Yeah.
Whereas on ventilation, the structures and the regulatory systems are similar, but there's not a culture of there's certainly not a culture with a long history in England of people having qualifications to install to install ventilation systems, and probably not a culture of building control taking it as seriously if somebody unqualified is installing a ventilation system. So one of the changes we've made, we've tried to, and it might look quite subtle to some people, but we've tried to put some more guidance up front to say, these are the additional checks that you should be carrying out if somebody without the right badge is installing a ventilation system, because that is a risk. I mean, people don't have to be qualified to install ventilation systems. You can install a fantastically performing ventilation system without being part of the competent person schemes, but it should, in my view, mean that your building control body is seeking additional evidence from you to make sure that they know your ventilation system is compliant in the same way that they would for electrical safety.
Yeah, and it's always dangerous drawing analogies between trades, but nonetheless, we've got a history in this part of the world of trades and qualifications and skills in things like electrical works, plumbing, gas, all of these things that sit within the mech and elec world. And ventilation, just by the nature of where it's come from historically, has effectively come from a few holes in walls and an electrician chucking the odd bathroom fan in the mid-80s, to now them being a fundamental pillar of building performance. And the reality is we simply don't have certainly a residential ventilation trade out there with associative qualifications. So we are a product of where we've come from. That's not necessarily by design. It's just where we are. The challenge is how do you navigate that through standards documents, and I think what the documents are trying to do, and it's an approach I often talk about with clients, is it's very hard for us to have control of the middle ground, but what we can control is the competency of design and the intent of design. What are our expectations about the accountability of the person that's deciding, whether that's designing a full MVHR system for a house or actually just simply making a choice as to what bathroom fan to put in your bathroom when you're getting it replaced. What is that bookend? How do we create accountability around that? And at the other end, how do we create accountability over the performance of that product? And did it meet the design intent? And to some degree, you can let the supply chain sort itself out in the middle without getting involved in the whataboutery of which fan you should be installing, what the performance of X, Y, and Z is. At the end of the day, if someone's accountable for the design and what you expect, and you check that that's what you got, the middle will probably sort itself out to a large degree. And the reality is ventilation won't blow you up, doesn't leak water, well, it shouldn't. It has. But generally speaking, you don't get calls on a Saturday afternoon that water's pouring through the ceiling because of ventilation systems. And it doesn't tend to electrocute people. There's a different level. The challenge with ventilation is that it's the single largest environmental risk we face as a human species, air quality. And the impacts are felt 30, 40 years down the road when we get it wrong. So while there may not be fires and damp and mold or structural failures or water pouring through ceilings, the damage can be equally as profound. And I think that's the problem that we've got, is that competency is based on a deferred risk that's just not been that visible up until now. And I think that's been the change within the built environment, is that we're starting to recognize that, hang on a minute, while I might not be having water pouring through my ceilings, that the impacts of poor ventilation are equally as profound. You're just not going to see it in the same way. And that's the challenge.
And like you say, ventilation in a building that was built in the 1970s probably happened by accident. We're increasing airtightness standards and insulation standards for buildings. That we can no longer rely on that accidental, incidental infiltration of buildings to make them healthy places to be. It's a system, and it needs some understanding, and it needs to be designed, and it needs somebody in the construction process to take account for it, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it might be a bit of a philosophical question to ask you, but some things won't change. I think some things will have to stay the same. There always has to be the law, the regulations, the legislative aspect of standards. That I think that there will always have to be guidance documents or codes of practice or approved documents to help frame that law in a way where people understand the intent behind that law in a way that they can apply it. But I've said this to you before. In 2024, the way we absorb information is not 50-page PDF documents anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And the question is, I suppose, what happens next? And is that the place of building standards to be imagining that or writing that new wave of information? Or should it be structured in some other way where other organizations like SIBSs and the BSAs and the those kind of industrial organizations fill that void? But there's no question, the trades and the professionals coming through now absorb and learn information in very different ways, and our access to information and how we use those toolkits are very different now than they were even 5 or 10 years ago. Is that something you're considering in your kind of longer term view of how standards are constructed?
Yeah, it's absolutely something that the regulator is going to look at in the longer term. We won't change things overnight, but like you say, I think that a system where we're writing documents that are either printed documents or a PDF. I'm not sure that that's really the way that people on construction sites these days are interacting, or want to interact with something to tell them how to do something. Um, so so there is a sort of longer term intent to look at some of the fundamental principles behind the standards. Should it be a PDF document, like you say, or a printed document? What's the role of government in writing guidance, and what's the role of industry? And my personal view is that government's always going to have a role in writing guidance, but that industry can take a greater role in some respects, and there are some good practice examples actually in some areas, and I'll take the IET. I'm going back to electrical now, but the IET's on-site guide for electricians, I think it's fantastic, and it's a little booklet like that an electrician can flick through and find the relevant bits of the building work, the building regulations, and the relevant parts of the guidance to help them understand how to do a particular job. Maybe that kind of document wants to look at a digital future, but that's a good example of some industry leadership there, actually, in trying to distill the information that's in the approved documents. Because if you're doing building work, actually you need to comply with all of the different parts of the building regulations. I don't think it's, I can't be naive and think that somebody installing a ventilation system in an existing building, for example, is going to read through probably thousands of pages of building regulations guidance to find the relevant bits. It's just not going to happen. So I think there is a modernisation exercise that will be valuable, and to look at what digitalisation could be valuable as well. But like I say, I think there is a role for industry as well in helping people to apply to apply the standards in the way that they're intended, without relying on everybody having spent months and years reading through approved documents to find the right bits.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think both can be true. I think industry will always step in, and there are some excellent guides for different aspects of things. The challenge is how that's coordinated, and to make sure that there aren't gaps, and that it's done in a way that feeds into the latest, framing from standards and the regulator. And I guess interestingly, to bring it back to the HSE has got a long history of not just the law and the guidance, but also a lot of supplementary information, different ways of communicating. Think of health and safety at work, all sorts of posters, campaigns, and badges, and stickers and information material, and they've worked very hard over the years to try and whether it's farm safety or building safety or whatever it is, like that. There's a whole infrastructure within the HSE of communicating risk.
Yes.
And this is what it's about. It's about risk communication, both construction risk, but also longer health term risk. There's a lot of dots to be joined, I think, potentially going forward.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of untapped potential there for my areas of work. Like I said, the HSE's an organisation that's got a great sort of outward facing and public messaging machine that we have used for communicating messages around high risk and high rise buildings, for example, and the new regime that's coming in, but that perhaps we haven't yet used to its full extent when we're talking about the technical aspects of the building regulations. So that's definitely an area potentially for future, in looking at how how government and the regulator can get messaging out there about building regulations, compliance, and that looks at all buildings, and that looks at all of the functions of buildings, including air quality and all of the other standards stuff that we do. Because like I say, it's not just fire and structural safety. There's lots and lots of stuff that we do as an organisation to try and improve the standard of buildings.
Yeah. From a ventilation perspective, what's your sense of what the what next is for standards in that sector? Like you say, not a lot has materially changed in the numbers, let's say, in the standards. Like that, we're pretty confident that they're broadly where they need to be. Yeah. You're shifting the dynamics on performance checking and control and skills. But where does it go next, do you think? Are you looking at things like ongoing performance and maintenance and things like that? Or
the very next thing that will change is implementing or at least responding to the government consultation that was carried out, like we talked about that concluded in January this year for the ventilation standards. I think beyond that, we're doing a research project at the moment actually on looking at health and indoor infection and the interaction between that and ventilation. So back when we did the 2021 standards, that was we were sort of coming out of the COVID pandemic, or at least the peak of the COVID pandemic. And because of that, we included some guidance, and might not have been that widespread that this is known. We included some guidance in the non-domestic standards about how to reduce the risk of airborne infection in offices, and you could apply that to other similar types of buildings. Frankly, we had to do that in quite a rush, as you can imagine. There's a global pandemic going on.
Yeah, I was about to say you and everybody else on the planet. Yeah,
there was a whole flurry of research going on that none of which had come to fruition really. So we had to make our best estimates essentially, and on what was going to be a proportionate and useful set of standards to make for these types of buildings. We included for the first time in building regs requirements to install air quality monitoring, so CO2 monitoring in non-domestic buildings. So what we've decided to do in the last year or so since we've got here actually is to say, okay, we made those changes, but let's actually, and this is sort of a little bit back to front actually, let's look at the underlying science and the evidence to make sure, one, that we've got that right and we've got that at the right level, but two, to look at opportunities for improving indoor air quality with a focus on in infection resilience in future, and that's not just a COVID thing either. Having healthy office places where people aren't spreading coughs and colds around should be beneficial, regardless. So that's going on, and that is one of the real benefits again that we found of being at the HSE, because the HSE carried out lots of this research during COVID. And have some great health expertise, and have already done lots of studies on things like UV filtration and the effectiveness of ventilation in reducing infection spread within buildings. So that project's ongoing. it's not at a stage where we can share stuff yet, but I'm hoping we'll be able to publish that in the new year, and I think that may well be the basis that we build on the next version of regulations and guidance.
Yeah, and I think that follows an international trend of, we've seen standards like ASHRAE 241 being produced that are trying to create and understand, infection resilience in buildings, and start to introduce interesting concepts we've never really had before, like equivalent air change rates. If you're not actually exchanging outdoor air, are you doing something that's equivalent to that with air cleaning and filtration? Looking at things like the modes of operations of buildings. Are there different modes in different infection risk profiles that might mean a building operates differently from one time to another? I think what's great about all of those conversations is it makes us rethink some of those basic numbers and basic principles of ventilation. Go, actually, in the context of something like a global pandemic, really makes you rethink, what a building's for. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting things that must be on your horizon as well is the environmental data we're getting out of buildings as well, and the impact that has on reframing what an outcome is. The building standards have typically been based around ventilation performance, but increasingly we're able to see through things like CO2 monitoring actual air performance in spaces or air quality performance, and that changes. And you started to do that a little bit in the annexes of the building standards, started to define pollutants a little bit more seriously, but that's got to be a trend that's going to continue, I guess, over the next few years. Is increasingly we'll start to determine outcomes based on an air quality outcome as much as whether or not it did half an air change an hour or 10 litres a second per person. It'll actually be more about what was the result in that space.
Yeah. And like you say, it's maybe hidden in an annex of approved document F, but at least we've set out the parameters to say this is what we think the indicators of good air quality are, and these are what we think is a good minimum standard for indoor air quality, and that's what the approved document is there to try and achieve as an outcome. So previous iterations, the approved document basically provided ventilation to control for moisture so that you don't get condensation.
Yeah.
And that was always taken as a sort of as a proxy for everything else. So if you control for moisture and ventilation, then everything else is probably okay. But we tested that, and looked at that, and I think that probably is the case for most things. But like everything in the approved documents, it's based on some assumptions, and if you've got particular pollutant producing activities or furniture or materials in your building, actually that's something that you might need to be a bit more careful about. And certainly the outlier when we looked at all these pollutants was formaldehyde. So really, if you have a building where you've got furniture and wood products that are producing formaldehyde, you probably shouldn't rely on the ventilation standards in approved document F if they're producing it in significant quantities to give you good air quality. Actually, that needs to be looked at both at source control, but also perhaps providing, perhaps even boost ventilation for the first couple of years while these products are still off gas.
I was going to say that actually. In his conversations I've had a couple times recently has been about, again, a kind of a bimodal operating setup in buildings, that if there's a particular risk, you recognise that and deal with that accordingly. And formaldehyde is a good example of that in new buildings or recently renovated buildings or buildings that have been recently furbished or refurbished. It may well be that the baselines in approved documents need to be considered in the context of that risk. The previous podcast guests and the evidence certainly seems to be suggesting that we understand a lot more where the harm is coming from pollutants in the indoor environment, and things like particulate matter, formaldehyde, combustion products, NO2 and radon and so on are all, we understand much more, can quantify the risks. And particulate matter seems to be heads and shoulders the big concern. And my guess is one of the things that will have to be reevaluated over the next decade is how we deal with cooking pollutants and background rates in kitchen areas and things like that, that it presents such a risk in the built environment, yes. Particulate matter that, and yourself, the cooker hood is the least considered piece of ventilation equipment in the home, and in a lot of circumstances, you're lucky if it was ever even connected properly. Yet it may well be one of the most fundamental pieces of equipment in the home. A lot of work going on in the States at the moment, trying to determine standards for cooker hoods, actual capture efficiencies and air change rates, and the kind of things that we need to understand to set the benchmarks we need to, because at the moment they're largely aesthetical decisions. Is it a wooden one for my country kitchen or a metal one for my modern kitchen, or the cheapest possible one if I'm chucking up houses? There's very little consideration at the moment for those. And something that we're very alive to. Historically, the approved documents have not really looked at particulates, and have always put them in a too difficult bracket, because, as you know, measuring particulates, you can't really differentiate between the bad ones and the good ones. But I think there's a body of evidence out there that makes it too difficult to ignore in the next review, I think. That's so measurable now. I think that's half the problem, Peter, is that we can measure them increasingly easily and accurately.
Yes. So we definitely want to, in the longer term, we want to have a look at cooker hoods. Not just performance in terms of capture efficiency and things, but also are people practically able to use them? And that's one of the things on my mind is, are people minded not to turn their cooker hoods on because they're too noisy? Could we set standards? Could we set standards there, for example?
Yeah, no, I do. And there's a lot of work going on, I think, at an industry level, particularly in the States at the moment on that. So I'd say there'd be some good movement in that direction. To bring it back, as we kind of wind up, Peter, you've now moved across to the HSE. As you said, this first kind of 12 months or so has been getting your feet under the table and understanding how to work with new colleagues and bring your team across. And obviously we've had the Grenfell inquiry and the Building Safety Act and all of that happening at the same time. Do you get a sense now is the next phase that you're now moving on with the workload and getting your head up and seeing what's next?
Definitely. That's definitely the case. We are ploughing our own furrow now on projects. I think it would be naive to assume that the landscape of things won't change, because this is like I said at the beginning, this new regulator and taking some of these functions out of central government for the first time in modern history can't be underestimated how big this is. The Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry reported in early September, like you said. The Prime Minister made a speech in Parliament to say that the government would respond to that within 6 months. And Government needs to get on with that. The Building Safety Regulator is here to support that government response and to implement government policy on that. So we will have to wait for the outcomes of that. But I expect that will involve quite a bit more change. But in terms of the project work that we're doing as a team to uplift and to keep the building regulations and standards under review and keep them technically sound, I'd say we're definitely in a new business as usual kind of mode now, which is different to how it works in the department, and we're able to focus on various different areas that we might not have been able to in the past. But like I said, we still have to work with central government, and we're still partners with them. But there's lots still, to be honest, to establish, but lots of work to be done, and I think, I'm glad for us to be able to have a greater focus on the technical standards themselves. I think that's been one of the changes actually in us moving over here from not being in a ministerial department anymore. We would have in the past spent quite a lot of our time, the technical team, dealing with parliamentary business, parliamentary questions, correspondence to ministers, and so on. And I think that had its own benefits in that you've got your technical people there directly interfacing with the minister, but it did take up quite a bit of our time. We're much freer from that now than we used to be. We're much more free now to undertake work without having to ask a minister for permission every time we want to do something, to make sure that it's still in line with their agenda. And we're here to look at things from an objective and technical perspective, and I hope that's going to be a benefit to the system moving forward. There's lots of parts of the building regs and standards that need attention, and I think this function of government now being arm's length from the ministerial department will allow us to continue spending our resources in a way that's going to benefit people the most.
Yeah, and I get a real sense talking to you an enthusiasm for this new period, that you are able to focus much more technically on stuff. You're out of the political noise to some degree. I mean, that accountability is always important, but you are a technical standards writing organisation. Your job is to, deliver the best standards that you can. And I get a sense that the HSE seems like a really good home for that, which is great to see.
Yeah, exactly.
Peter, it's been brilliant talking to you as always. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend time talking on the podcast. I think it's been a really insightful conversation for people on how this machine works. So I thank you for that. Thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, been really great to talk. No, thanks, Simon.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed this podcast and know someone else who might be interested, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. This podcast was brought to you in partnership with 21 Degrees, Lindab, ACO, Ultra Protect and Imbiot. All great companies who share the vision of the podcast and aren't here by accident. Your support of them helps their support of this podcast. Do check them out in the links and at airqualitymatters.net.